All right, we'll start in a minute or two, and then we'll get it going. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second panel of our Intro to Chicago Politics webinar series. My name is Reina Hernandez, and my lovely friend and cohort mate, Noah Newmark, who is on the call. Both of us co-organized this series due to our curiosity as sociologists about the city and state that we're privileged to study in. We're excited to be in the presence of great minds, so thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your time and being in conversation with us. We want to give another shout out to SSR, Shannon and Gray. Thank you again so much for helping us organize the logistics and all that stuff for our panels. And to our colleagues and faculty, we more than appreciate your support. And now I'll hand it over to Kyla, and we hope you all enjoy.
Thanks, Reina, and thank you for organizing. I'm pretty excited to learn a little bit more about Chicago as well. We have a really awesome set of panelists for everyone here, and I think we're going to get into some really cool topics. So I will start by introducing Professor Bill Seitz.
Sorry, I had trouble with the mute button. Thank you, Kyla. My name is Bill Seitz. I'm an associate professor at the School of Social Service Administration, the social work school here at the University of Chicago. I am a sociologist by training, and a lot of my research and teaching focuses on issues of urban development and urban development politics, which is a topic that I look forward to speaking about today.
Great, thank you. Okay, how about Sarah Bozick next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Wasick. I am the projects coordinator with Change Illinois. Change is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization with a 501c4 advocacy arm that focuses on systemic government and elections reforms within the state of Illinois. A little bit about me. I have worked on the campaign policy and constituent services side of state and federal government officials. I graduated from U of C in 2019 with a double major in public policy and philosophy, and my undergraduate research focused on education funding models in the state of Illinois.
Cool, thanks, Sarah. How about Stevie Valles next?
Hello, everyone. Stevie Valles from Chicago Votes. I am the executive director over there. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that focuses on getting young people more engaged in the political process through civic education, leadership development, advocacy work, as well as voter turnout and voter registration work. I am a graduate of Oakwood University with a degree in social work, and I am excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you, Stevie. Sorry I didn't pronounce your name properly, even though I asked. And then finally we have Professor Dick Simpson.
Hi folks, I'm Dick Simpson. I'm professor of political science at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I'm also a former alderman and a former congressional candidate.
Great, okay, cool, thank you. So before we get started, I just want to welcome everyone for coming and say how fascinating Chicago can be for those of you who maybe aren't from Chicago or trying to learn more about Chicago. Full disclosure, I'm Canadian, I can't vote, and so I'm just in it for the entertainment value, I guess. But I've been here for about 10 years and it's been so enlightening to learn so much about Chicago and come at it from a comparative lens. So for those of you who are from a different place and have questions, be sure to let us know in the chat box or ask lots of questions because there's lots to learn. So how about we start off just really broadly? Maybe Bill, you could start us off with what you think the most core political issue is right now, maybe in Chicago and in Illinois, in Chicago or in Illinois?
Well, I think it's hard to avoid the fact that the most overwhelming issue for many people is simply the COVID pandemic. And while I am not a health expert by any means, I think we all know that the pandemic has had sort of enormous consequences for Chicagoans. It's had particularly devastating consequences in lower income communities and Black and brown communities in particular. What I think people are learning as well, though, is that the economic consequences of the pandemic have also been both quite extensive so far and quite concentrated in some ways in disadvantaged communities. And so if we look at unemployment rates now in Chicago, we see Black unemployment rates, which are always higher than those of whites, are quite a bit higher now. We see this is true for women as well. Women workers are unemployed at higher rates. This is partly because of the sectors of the local economy that these workers are concentrated in, right? The most devastated sectors have been the hospitality sector, tourism, entertainment, retail, certain kinds of services, in-person services. And so these losses are really quite extreme and are being felt by families, all, I think, throughout our communities in Chicago. But as I said, particularly concentrated in certain communities where those workers are themselves concentrated. I think housing as well is another issue linked to this, which is clearly an overwhelming and pressing issue, even under good times in a city like Chicago, where affordability issues have become quite acute. But now under this crisis, where folks are losing jobs or they're losing hours or their inability, they're struggling to make rent. And we see this reflected in the rental market now. And we see this increasingly reflected in just the ordinary struggles that people are experiencing, the negotiating they're trying to do with their landlords, and the potential consequences this has for our housing sector down the road in terms of housing abandonment and other kinds of issues. I want to say more at some point about how these problems are situated in a kind of a longer history in Chicago, because I think that there's a lot to be learned by sort of viewing this crisis in that larger context, but I'll let other people kind of jump in at this point and sort of talk about kind of most pressing immediate issues.
Okay, so we got a lot on Chicago on the table. How about Illinois? As you were speaking, I was thinking a little bit about this tax bill that's up in Illinois, if there's any other legislation that some of the panelists think is pretty important. Sarah, what do you think?
So we actually got word today when COVID-19 hit, all of the legislative session got canceled along with everything else that got canceled. And a lot of bills, a lot of criminal justice reform bills that we had been watching, hope for a fair maps amendment in the state of Illinois. those hopes and dreams are kind of getting diminished at the moment, because just today we got an email saying that with rising COVID-19 cases, they may have to cancel the veto session, which was going to be coming up in November. And it was really policy advocates and legislators' only chance to pass anything this year. So as we were just talking about how COVID-19 has really extrapolated a lot of discrepancies in equity in Chicago and Illinois, I think that we're continuing to have to reorient what our priorities are in the state and in the city. So
you're saying that the Illinois legislature is going to be even slower than it already is?
They're going to be even slower. And on top of that, the loss in revenue, the city budget came out yesterday, I believe, and we're looking at the cuts. We're looking at what they're going to have to do. We're going to have to see what the city and state are going to come up with for borrowing in what is already a pretty dire situation in the city and state. So it'll be interesting.
What do you think is up to be cut first?
At the city or state level? Well, so Lori Lightfoot presented her city budget to the city and the council. What they were discussing were, and I know this was brought up in what we wanted to talk about today, but the implications of the national election and getting funding from the federal government for city and state just to help out our finances. They are talking about some layoffs in March 2021, so hopefully that won't have to happen. Restructuring how they borrow was, I believe, put in the city plans, and of course there is no state budget yet. So
just to amplify a little on the city, they're talking about firing or layoffs of 350 people and leaving 1,000 positions vacant. That's 1,000 people in city government we won't be hiring next year. The city's problem is a $2 billion problem. If the graduated income tax doesn't pass, the state will be short another $3 to $4 billion that it would get out of the graduated income tax.
So that bill's fairly important from your perspective. Bill, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to jump in and just point to the issue that Sarah pointed to, which is this sort of the larger context of the federal government and its role in the acute fiscal pressures that city and the state are experiencing. Chicago and Illinois are not unique in this respect. We've heard a lot, I think, over the years about Chicago's budget woes and Illinois' budget issues, and they do have some particular wrinkles, but there's catastrophic circumstances fiscally now in many states and many cities across the country. And the absence of a federal role in stepping in to supply even temporary and short-term forms of aid that can let cities and states weather this moment is really, it's quite extreme.
Okay, so we have lots of things on the table. Stevie, did you want to add something that hasn't been touched on or elaborate?
I would just add that, systemic racism continues to be a problem that's underlying all that has been shared thus far. With all of the issues that have already been discussed, the communities that are most directly impacted are Black and Brown communities, both in Chicago and statewide. And with an election coming up very soon, it's important to note that these same communities experience the most barriers when it comes to casting a ballot. So just to put a finer point on the undercurrent of systemic racism that exists as a part of all of the issues that have been shared. And beyond that, I agree. All of the issues that have been shared are the most pressing for the state and the city.
I think that actually segs pretty well into our sort of next.
I wanted to add just a few other items. So if you think about what is Chicago we're number one of, it becomes a particular set of problems which maybe the people on this call would like to deal with. As Stevie was saying, put it another way, we're the most segregated city in North America. Now, some years we tend to lose that. Sometimes Milwaukee or Dallas will be more segregated than we are. But the fact that we would be still 50 years from when we first started studying the level of segregation in Chicago, and of course we knew about it much earlier, that we'd still be number one is pretty shocking. And it's also shocking because particularly the Latino and Asian communities tend to be a little more dispersed. So to give some particular numbers, the segregation index, when I first started studying it in the 60s, was at 94, meaning 94% of the people would have to move to live in a community with the same racial balance as the metropolitan region. We've improved. So now we're only 72% segregated. That still means 3/4 of the people would have to move to live in a neighborhood that had a balance that was the same. And the consequences of that have already been hinted by the other panelists, which is the institutional racism and its effects on the communities tend to push up crime. They tend to make schools worse. They make job opportunities fewer and so forth. And I'm sure everybody's been studying that in class. But that's one thing where we lead the parade on. The other thing, one of the several other things that we're top in the nation of, we're the most corrupt city in North America. Chicago by far has more corruption convictions by the federal government than any other metropolitan region. And as a state, since we're talking about the state, we're doing a lot better. We're only the third most corrupt state in the country. There are still 50 states. And so the fact that 47 states have less corruption than we do, that shows up in dissatisfaction. That shows up in, I don't remember that off the top of my head, but it's something like 28% of the people think Illinois is headed in the right direction. When they did a study of corporate executives, a lot of corporate executives are thinking about moving, not just because of the pandemic and the current crisis, but the ongoing corruption. I could go on and on with the things we're number one at. The only other one I would hint at is our political history is one of machine politics. And with the Lightfoot administration, we have the opportunity of finally moving out from the shadow of not only the Richard J. Daley machine, but the later more modernized 21st century machines of Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel. And whether we get there or not will depend on all of us, not just on Lori Lightfoot.
So how do other people feel about that? Do we feel like Lori Lightfoot is this hope, better than Preckwinkle?
I personally will not be touching that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. The machine politics are certainly real. They're certainly real. I have heard some people voicing dissatisfaction with Mayor Lightfoot, though, and I wonder if anyone has a comment on that.
I will say to that question, there's definitely dissatisfaction. We have a Black woman in office, but it does not feel as though Black communities or the voices of the peaceful protesters or a litany of other folks who were hoping to have an elevated voice in local government, it doesn't feel like that's actually been achieved. Just today, we just found there's a number of hospitals that are going to be closed on the south and west sides of Chicago, which is not ideal. The schools continue to be underfunded. COVID-19 has only exacerbated inequities that have already existed. But the messaging coming out of the mayor's office, at the very least, doesn't seem to be prioritizing these communities, and the policies haven't seemed to be prioritizing these communities neither. And I've served with Professor Simpson on the mayor's transition committee, where we came up with a number of recommendations for how government can be more transparent, how these communities can be prioritized. And up to this point, it hasn't felt as though those recommendations have been taken into account, or at least prioritized. So I'll share that. But in terms of a comparison between the two, you never know.
Well, I would add to that, and I agree with what Stevie was saying in terms of the characterization of some of the trends that are happening now. That there is a longer term set of issues here that are very much rooted partly in sort of systemic and institutional racism in housing markets, in labor markets, and so forth. And these forces are deeply inscribed, not just in sort of urban settings in Chicago, but throughout much of the US and in other cities as well. But there's also a kind of a more specific pattern of urban development politics in Chicago that too often tend to reinforce those processes. And what I mean by that is what we might call a kind of downtown corporate-centered development agenda. We saw this particularly dramatically under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, where so much of the economic activity, so much of the energy of the city went into creating economic development downtown in places where it was already clustered, luring corporate headquarters downtown, directing public subsidies to those kinds of development. And those kinds of resource flows tended to exacerbate disinvestment in outerlying neighborhoods. And we've seen at certain moments in Chicago's history, unless, it's important to, I'll raise the flag about one very positive sort of signal development in Chicago's history. There have been moments when city administrations have balanced those downtown development priorities with a neighborhood's agenda, with an agenda that really actively tries to redirect resources to more underserved communities. The Harold Washington administration in the 1980s was, Harold Washington, for folks who don't know Chicago, was the city's first African-American mayor. And his administration very much articulated a development program that sought to balance downtown development with neighborhood forms of growth and job creation and housing development and so forth. And to your question about Mayor Lightfoot, Kyla, I think it's important to recognize that as a campaigner, and indeed early in her administration, Mayor Lightfoot definitely echoed many of the Harold Washington themes about balancing downtown development with more neighborhood-centered growth and opportunity. And I think it's important and I think, this sort of dovetails a bit with Dick's comment, it's important that all of us seek to hold her accountable to that kind of a platform. Because what happens during moments like this one, where we're facing budget crises and budget cuts and fiscal austerity, is that those moments often tend to actually involve a backing away from those kinds of commitments. And the cuts, the service cuts, the budget balancing tends to fall disproportionately on those who are already suffering.
Thanks, Bill. I think the idea of accountability that you bring up is really important. Since we've been seeing through the spring and the summer, everyone on the streets protesting police brutality, a mechanism of accountability. But does anyone have any suggestions for other avenues, maybe more institutional avenues? Obviously voting, but beyond that, where there's a potential for accountability, there's failed accountability, successful accountability?
I'm happy to jump in here. So at Change Illinois, at the state level and the city level, we are advocating for independent remapping. The situation that we have at the state level and the city level is that the politicians get to draw either their legislative districts or their ward maps. And we're talking about where Illinois ranks. Illinois is the 5th least competitive state for elections. So the state Senate and the state legislature, currently 62 out of the 103 races that are happening across Illinois are uncontested. So there is a representative or a state senator who all they have done to get their seat is win their primary and send the right forms into the State Board of Elections, and then they will be representing Illinoisans. In Illinois at the state level, it's because of partisan gerrymandering. The political party, which in this case is the Democratic Party, draws the maps. And in the city of Chicago, the wards are also gerrymandered. So when we're talking about Mayor Lightfoot and her accountability, she has to work with the city council. And the city council has their own priorities and is creating their wards that fit the purposes of those particular aldermen. And it's that's how it's been done historically, the Chicago machine. And I'm sure other individuals on this panel can add a lot more to that than I can. But if we're talking about systemic changes that will create accountability mechanisms for these legislators and for these elected officials, ending gerrymandering is a really solid place to start.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Obviously, gerrymandering has been a big issue, not just at the local level, state level. I didn't realize Illinois was quite that bad.
It's very bad. We're horrible.
I can't say I'm super surprised.
At the national level, about 94% of the congressmen get reelected if they run. If they're incumbents and they run, 94% of them get returned. I can tell you from fairly close watch of some of the congressmen that you do not deserve to go back to Washington.
Just from corruption, from laziness, from?
Many of them have gotten, don't represent their districts well. Many of them don't really produce much in the way of legislation. And yes, some are corrupt. Quite a few congressmen have been convicted of corruption. But it's judgment district by district. We have some very good congressmen out of Illinois, and we've got some others who ideally would be ready for retirement. The districts for Congress are also done by the state legislature, and they are gerrymandered. Some for good reasons, like the creation of a Latino district, some for very bad reasons, just to protect the incumbent.
I might throw out another example where maybe it's bucking the trend a little bit. It might be because, you know, mapping isn't as important, but the renewed interest in electing judges and prosecutors in Illinois. You know, and coming from Canada, the idea of electing a judge and electing a prosecutor is, you know, disturbing. Like that's the crown, right? But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about this shift towards holding criminal justice institutions accountable through voting.
So first of all, electing judges is a terrible idea. We, in 1970, in the state constitution, had an amendment that would have allowed for merit selection of judges, and the two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, combined to defeat that amendment. We adopted the Constitution. It was the best in the nation at the time for a state, but we did not adopt a merit selection of judges. In addition, if you look at your ballot, and even if you're not a voter, you can go and see the model ballot. Take a look at the judges we're electing for Cook County. Very interesting fact, there's not a single Republican on the entire ballot for all of the judges of Cook County, including major higher levels of obviously state judges, not federal. The idea of putting a term limit on judges is, I think, a good one. And Biden was saying in the debate last night that if he becomes president, that he will appoint a commission to figure out some ways in which judges are at least not necessarily for life, but for long enough that they have the opportunity to still be impartial. We do need, and that's at the federal level, we do need reforms at all levels. Another major factor, and you could speak to this because of your familiarity at the jail, but originally we, in my view, had the worst judicial system in the United States other than Louisiana, where they have parish judges that are more corrupt than we are, at least attempt to be. We've made improvements in the local court system, but under Gaylord, which was the criminal investigation of our courts in Illinois, more than 50 court personnel went to jail, including 13 judges in that circumstance and another 6 judges. You don't usually think of a judge being sent to federal prison, but they were. And they were being sent because they fixed trials, including murder trials.
Kyle, I wanted to jump in with another word about accountability, which is what some of the other panelists I think have also talked about, because I do think that not the full story, but an important component of ordinary people trying to hold their elected officials accountable happens sort of, at least initially, at the community level. In other words, it happens at that level at which ordinary people decide to become involved in something that we might call politics. And I think that for a lot of people, Stevie could probably talk about this more, for young people especially, seeing themselves as participating in politics as a kind of separate institutional realm that somehow they're going to enter and kind of have a voice in is a stretch, I think, initially. And yet if people see politics as something that's happening in their neighborhood, in their community, it's something that happens with and to their families, to their friends and peer groups, then I think it's more likely that people find a way to participate in ways that make sense for them and develop a voice. And that voice can be demonstrating in the street. It can be participating in coalition building work. It can be delivering services at the neighborhood level in various ways. And I think that all of these, while not immediately holding elected officials accountable, do bring people into participatory politics in a way that make politicians feel more watched, that in effect create constituencies that can pressure local officials and push them to be more responsive to their constituents in the ways, in different ways that I think can really make a difference.
I'll just say, judicial accountability is one of the pillars of a program we run at Chicago Votes called Unlock Civics. This program works to increase access to the ballot and civic knowledge for people who are experiencing incarceration. We've passed 2 laws already as part of this initiative. One of those laws turned the Cook County Jail into a polling location. Another one of those laws requires that people with less than 12 months left on their prison sentence are given access to civic education courses so that when they're released, they understand how government works and they know that they have the right to vote reinstated. In our experience working in both prisons and jails, one of the strongest selling points for people who are incarcerated to register to vote and participate in the elections is letting them know that they get to vote for judges and letting them know that they get to vote for prosecutors. One of the issues though is finding information on judges and making sure that voters understand who these judges are. So if they are problematic, they could go to the ballot and vote them out, is extremely difficult. I think on this ballot, we have upwards of 60+ judges on the ballot, and gathering accurate information on each one of those judges takes a lot of work. Chicago Votes did put out a judicial voter guide that basically lets people know who these judges are based off of data that's been gathered by the Illinois Bar Association. We're doing that in partnership with Chicago Appleseed and the Justice Watch. We also are advocating for 2 pieces of legislation that we feel will improve our judicial system here in Illinois. One requires that, make sure that people cannot be prohibited from serving on a jury if they have a felony conviction. Because our legal system has so negatively targeted Black and brown people, giving judges the opportunity to restrict people from serving on their jury because they have a felony conviction, in turn, is a way to prevent Black and brown people from serving on juries. And that is problematic because it's mainly Black and brown people going before judges to begin with. And that's tipping the odds against them in our legal system, and the odds are already against us in the legal system. The other bill that we're advocating for around judicial accountability is that judges receive quarterly training around racial and gender biases, as well as youth brain development. A child's brain or a youth's brain doesn't finish developing until they're about 26. So here in Illinois, young people as early as 16, 17 years old can still receive life sentences. A number of people are in prison who have life sentences, who were given those life sentences when they were under the age of 26. And in Illinois, there is no parole for people who have life sentences. That was done away with in 1978. So if you're given a life sentence, you have no eligibility for parole. So those are kind of some of the ways we're trying to increase judicial accountability through the civic process, even beyond voting. And I think that's important to know.
I would point out that any of you can join groups like Chicago Votes or like Change Illinois or Reform Illinois. There are a bunch of groups that you could be a part of that are working to make change. I would make just a couple of points. The 2020 election is probably the most important election in your lifetime. You know, I could spend a long time spelling that out, but I suspect most of you know that. It is still time. You can vote early and go register and vote at the same polling place, or you can do that election day. If you have gotten a mail-in ballot, you can go ahead and still send that ballot in, or you can deliver it to an early voting site's locked box that's run by the Board of Election. We had originally thought that we were going to increase the student vote this time over 2016 by 2 million student voters because of doing so well at registration and so many more organizations across the country working on it, and so many more universities civically engaged than they used to be. That's now in great doubt because of the pandemic. So I don't think I can stress too much. The direction of the country will be affected by the 2020 election. The viability of the state funding. So it's easy at a place like mine, the University of Illinois in Chicago, our funding depends directly on whether or not the graduated income tax happens. But so does your MAP grant for those of you that get MAP grants. So does social services and human services. So does the money available to the homeless or to the mentally ill, and so on and so forth. If the state doesn't get the $4 billion that it can get from the graduated income tax, what we value that the state does is going to be directly impacted in a very powerful way. So it's not just at the national level, it's at the state level and some of the more local elections.
Thanks, Dick. I think maybe stepping back just for a second on the income or the graduated income tax bill, and maybe Sarah, you can speak to just defining it, maybe laying out the pros and cons a little bit for those of us who don't necessarily understand.
So Change Illinois doesn't have a position on the fair tax or the graduated income tax, but what I can say as an individual is that There are 32 states out of the 50 that have a graduated income tax structure. What Illinois has is a flat tax, so everyone is taxed at the same percent. This is constitutionally mandated, and what is currently on the ballot is to change that constitutionally mandated flat tax to a graduated income tax that would increase in proportion to how much money you are bringing in. From my understanding with school funding, a lot of that money will go to try and equalize, to fund the evidence-based funding model that was passed in 2019 to try and more equitably fund schools in the state of Illinois. Another fun fact about the state of Illinois is that before the EBF, or evidence-based funding, was passed, we were ranked 49th in education inequality for how we get money to our students. And this disproportionately impacts Black and Brown and disabled students. So that is what I can personally say about the personal income tax, or on the fair tax. Change Illinois does not have a position, so we are not advocating for anything specifically, but other people can add more to that.
I would just add that what is on the ballot is a referendum, which would, if it receives sufficient votes, permit changing the Illinois state constitution so as to permit enactment of a fair tax. And it is one of those moments where a very important question is being taken directly to the voters. And so the actual question on the ballot itself is unusual in the sense that I think a lot of ballot referenda in Illinois are advisory, they are symbolic, they are sometimes important even though they're symbolic, but this one has very real and immediate consequences. It's also part of whether it passes or not depends on how many people actually vote, period. There's kind of a formula there. So voter turnout is going to be very important around this issue.
And was the initial flat tax, was that, how did that come to be? Does anyone know? Dick, maybe?
Yes, it was a compromise that was built into the 1970 Constitution, that there are not too many restrictions in the state constitution of 1970, but that was one, that the only tax we can have, the only income tax we can have is a flat tax. And the rate on the flat tax has fluctuated over the last 50 years, but it has never been able to be graduated in a true sense like the graduated income tax proposal on the ballot this time.
So what was the logic behind that? What was...
As old Mayor Daley used to tell me, you ain't got the votes, kid. The only way you could get an income tax, because back then an income tax was not popular in all the states and in the country. So it was as a national tax, but not as a state tax. So the only way it could get passed and the Constitution get passed, the two political parties that were dominant was to go for a flat tax instead of a graduated tax. Many things are compromises. It's very good if you're at the table and can affect the outcome, and most of you aren't. So I'm encouraging you to get to the table.
Right, right. So we're identifying a few constituencies, I think. Youth, Dick, you've been noting that, college students. I think Stevie identifying incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people. I didn't even realize that felons were enfranchised in Illinois, and I study the criminal justice system here. So it goes to show you, in some sense, the hurdles that people can face. But I will say, also just a little bit of praise for the movement to get the polling place inside of Cook County Jail. We were talking about this a little bit before the program started, and I do some work in the jail, and the men I work with were quite excited about being able to vote for their for the person who's prosecuting them, and they generally preferred her over, you know, the sort of Republican.
Pat O'Brien is the Republican running.
Pardon me?
Pat O'Brien is the Republican.
Pat O'Brien. Sure. Which, you know, I think says a lot for how one can be politicized when one is confronted with state power in such a kind of total way when you're incarcerated. So does anyone have any other constituencies that they're working to mobilize or they think could be a new power in Illinois, a new voice in Illinois, this election, future elections?
2 points. One, we did lousy on the census, and that's going to cost us 2 congressional seats and billions of dollars in funding. We only got 60% counted in the census before the Trump administration closed it. It will be adjusted some, but it'll probably be the Trump officials who will adjust it, and they've even had discussions about not counting immigrants and things of that sort. So we didn't, I mean, it was remarkable that we got back up to the 60%, which is what we did in 2010. And it was a major effort across a lot of groups. But one of the effects of the balance between the racial and ethnic groups that needs to be considered is the third power in Chicago politics are Latinos. And the Latino vote in Chicago is going to become, as it is nationally, become ever more important. In fact, it could easily swing the presidential election this time, for example. But locally, Latinos are still not an equal amount in the city council, for instance, to their numbers. They're not an equal amount in the state legislature to their numbers, that is, to their population numbers or even their citizen numbers. So there's still, you know, if you were looking for one group to be mobilized, particularly at this election, Latinos and maybe Asian Americans would be 2 other groups that, if they were mobilized, would be able to flex considerable muscle, particularly Latinos, because of their numbers.
I would just add to that there has been a bright spot locally in terms of growing progressive representation on the city council. And some of that has come out of Latino communities in Chicago. Some of that is the result of some very, very intensive organizing by folks, and also by, I think, a growing presence by what we might call third parties or third-party organizations, such as Democratic Socialists of America, such as United Working Families, and the kinds of union and community organizations that have long sought to kind of create a progressive presence on the council, and in the process create an independent city council, a city council which doesn't operate as a rubber stamp for the mayor. And so these are important, even though they're very local. These are important ways in which people can sort of become involved in politics at that level where you can actually see your alderman. You can actually see your alderman being responsive to your community. One of the challenges of and Dick alluded to this earlier in terms of the machine, is that Chicago is effectively a one-party town. And as a Democratic Party town, what that means is that it's very easy for that one party to absorb progressive voices in the Democratic Party and neutralize them. And so what we have now is at least some very promising signs of not only a progressive caucus on the city council, but a socialist caucus as well. And these aldermen are doing really, I think, quite important work in terms of not only their sort of nuts and bolts kind of constituency work, but also in terms of the kinds of development politics that they want to see in Chicago, which are much more oriented toward working people, to addressing issues of housing affordability, and to some of the other issues that we've talked about in terms of greater transparency, so that we as constituents in the city of Chicago can actually know what's going on in government.
Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just jump in and add. So I am from Grace Lake, Illinois, and I've lived here my whole life. It's up way north of Chicago on the Wisconsin border. And if you're new to Illinois and Illinois and Chicago politics, most people in Illinois live in Chicago. I believe the Chicagoland area is home to about 9.5 million people, and there are 12.8 million people in the state. But if you're someone who's interested in getting involved in state politics, the capital of Illinois is not Chicago, it's Springfield, which is in the middle of the state and former home of Abraham Lincoln. So something that you'll notice as you're getting involved in state politics is that there's the Chicago machine, and then there's the rural areas in Illinois that have beef with the Chicago machine, I guess. They don't like them as much, they strike deals. So those politics are always very interesting, because once you get out of Chicago, it's cornfields and a lot of farmland, which is where I'm from, and I can say it because I live here, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, but it's not something that people think a lot about when they think about Illinois and Chicago, is that there's the rest of the state. And for example, here, like a big lobby is the Farm Bureau, and working with those individuals. And there's a lot of really conservative parts of Illinois, even though that it's controlled by Democrats because of Chicago.
And in some ways that just mirrors the dilemma, the bifurcation of the American country more generally, urban, rural. Sarah, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, a little bit different, but hopefully you have something to add on this. If I'm in Chicago and I'm in a gerrymandered ward, how do I find out what my ward looks like? How do I know who my alderman is?
You can Google the map. I never voted in Chicago, so I'm not 100% sure, but I know that, for example, Englewood, which is right next to Hyde Park, is cut into 6 districts, and Back of the Yards is cut into 6 districts. So these are very distinct communities that could be one ward. And could be represented by one individual, but instead they are carved out to protect incumbents or former incumbents. And it makes it really hard, for example, if you are a young person and all of the people in your neighborhood have a problem with what's happening with police violence and policing in communities, and you want to say, you know what, we're all going to go to our council person and we're going to say that we need something done about this because the way we're being treated is wrong, the way our community is being treated is wrong. But if you're a kid from Englewood or Back of the Yards and you're trying to find who to bring you and your community group to have this conversation, you're cut up into 6 wards. Who do you go to? And I think when we talk about voices and making sure that your voice is heard in government, it's really important to think about that. Who do you go to? How do we concentrate our representation in a way that represents people and not so much what was convenient for the people who were in office at the time?
Just a point on that. Back before the pandemic, aldermen had regular aldermanic nights, which were open, and anybody from their ward could go and meet with them. And my rule of thumb was that if you could get 20 people from the ward to go meet with the alderman, you could get them to do almost anything legislatively, from getting a stop sign locally to voting no on Mayor Lightfoot's budget or whatever the issue was. It's a little more tricky in the time of Zoom, but it's still doable if you organize people by ward. And yes, there are a number of websites that if you simply put in your address, it will tell you what ward you live in.
And just on top of that, Google the map of the Chicago wards. See what it looks like and see if that makes sense. If you were to draw a community, look at the map of the Chicago wards and say, is this logical, or why does this look like this? And just think about it for a little bit. That's your little assignment.
Thanks, Sarah. I've always confused. I've lived in Chicago for a decade, and I've moved around several neighborhoods, and I'm always kind of confused why I go for a walk with my dog and I see 5 different campaign signs for 5 different people. I mean, I don't vote, so, you know, but how about Stevie? How about you could add a little bit about just voter mobilization, organization, the work that Chicago Votes has been doing, helping people to vote.
Yeah, so I shared in the chat earlier, the Chicago Votes Vote Center. On that website, you'll see the Chicago Votes Voter Guide, which is one of the mechanisms we use to mobilize people around voting, making sure that they understand what each office does, making sure they understand who the candidates are, making sure they understand how those political offices impact your lives and where the candidates stand on key issues that matter to you. That voter guide includes the state's attorney race, the water reclamation district, the tax referendum, as well as all of the judicial candidates. We, again, do a lot of work in the Cook County Jail to make sure voters are mobilized there. Our focus is young people, ages 17 to 35. We have phone banks and text banks to low propensity voters in that age group that we host every Tuesday and Thursday night. We also do voter registration. Obviously, our voter registration drives are digital right now, but we mobilize to make sure young people across the city are registered to vote. We also go to the Chicago Board of Elections board meetings every other Tuesday to voice our perspective and input on the elections as young people in the city of Chicago. We have a court watching program that we do where we gather data on the judges who are on the bench, especially the judges who are seeking retention. And we mobilize young people to disseminate that information to their audiences in an effort to inform youth as they go to cast their ballots for judicial candidates. We also have a program called Give a Shit Chicago, which is an initiative we run to get young people who are creatives, artists, rappers, poets, dancers, whatever, who are not in traditional institutions like colleges, high schools, and unfortunately jails and prisons, to get engaged in the political process. We have a weekly Instagram live series called Shit Talks, where we bring on organizers, elected officials, community members to talk about the election and other issues that impact Chicago. So as you have heard, we do a lot. And it's important to note that we do this beyond voting season. Young people have a traditionally low voter turnout rate in Chicago and Illinois and America, which is extremely unfortunate. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that young people, unfortunately, don't necessarily see the value in voting. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that young people have a tendency to vote every 4 years. And if you do that, then you're not going to see the impact in voting. So we try to keep the civic engagement going around the clock. So even beyond election season, we do legislative advocacy work. We do elected official accountability work, where we're teaching young people how to write bills, how to advocate for bills, how to implement bills, so people can start to understand civics and politics as a round-the-clock, 24/7, 365 thing, and don't view voting as something that they have to do every 4 years and then get confused as to why nothing's changing. And we also try to play up those local elections as well, because like we've talked about a little bit on this call, those local races, you feel the impact of those a little bit more prevalently than you do those races that are on the presidential or federal level.
So it sounds like there's a lot of places people can get engaged with your group, from artists to phone bankers.
Yep. We're in colleges, high schools, communities, jails, juvenile detention centers, prisons, clubs, you name it, we're there. And whoever you are, there's a way to plug in.
Wow. Well, I think that's unless anyone else wanted to add something to that, that's kind of a really optimistic and lovely way, I think, to end the panelist portion of our conversation. And it's exactly what Chicago needs, in my opinion. You know, we talked a little bit about the history of Chicago. It's a city of police torture. It's a city where Fred Hampton was assassinated. It's a city where LaCon McDonald was shot. But it's also, I think, a city that's inescapably political and has a political passion. You know, it's the Haymarket City, you know. So I think that's a wonderful and optimistic way to end. And I thank you for your work. And I thank all of our panelists for contributing. I think we're just going to switch over to some audience questions. So if you have a question that's burning on your mind, please add it to the chat box. I have a few that have been waiting for a while. The first one is for Stevie. And she asks, you mentioned a set of practices suggested to Mayor Lightfoot to increase transparency and representation. And so I think the question is asking maybe a little bit more specificity about those practices, the transparency representation practices, and also what you think the barriers would be for implementing reform.
Yes, I'm happy to answer that. And Professor Simpson was actually one of the chairs of that committee that we were on. So Dick, if it's cool with you, I'll just talk about what Chicago Vote suggested specifically and maybe kick it over to you to talk about what the committee suggested.
Sure.
Great. So Chicago Votes, you know, we are a nonpartisan group, again, that focuses on 17 to 35-year-olds. So our recommendations were very much centered around, you know, our base. We recommended that Chicago consider having an independent advocate that is elected by the people to kind of serve as a government watchdog and whose sole purpose is to report on ethics to the community and different situations that are happening in City Hall, basically be voice and eyes of the people. And it kind of gets to what Professor Simpson was speaking on earlier about Chicago being the most corrupt city in the country. This is not new. This is something that New York City has. And I think it's extremely powerful. And I think it would increase voter turnout if we were voting for someone to make sure that government isn't corrupt, because a lot of young people don't vote again because they have lost faith in the system, partially due to this corruption. We also suggested a youth advisory council to be a part of the city's official infrastructure at City Hall level. And this would be a group of young people representing diverse backgrounds in the city who would see the work that's going on in City Hall and provide feedback to the mayor and to city council on how youth feel about it, how it's going to impact their community, our community, and play up the role of young people having a seat at the table of government. One of the barriers that we experienced and try to advance things like this is the fact that youth voter turnout isn't that high. So the inclination for city government to do favors for us is not very high neither. It's hard to have a voice in government when government doesn't feel accountable to you, because government, especially those members or those elected officials who are elected, are accountable to the voters. And so when you look at the voting rolls and you see that, you know, the wards in Black and brown communities have lower voter turnout and young people have lower voter turnout, it's harder for young people from Black and brown communities to have an elevated voice in government. So I'll leave it at that and kick it over to Professor Simpson to talk a little bit more on the official recommendations that came from the actual committee.
So there were 10 committees in the transition team. The transition team report is public and you can Google it. It's 110 pages long, as I remember, about 200 recommendations. Roughly speaking, there were two coalitions that helped elect Mayor Lightfoot. One, a good government coalition that wanted reforms related to things like corruption. The other, a progressive coalition. And we've talked a little bit about some of the issues, some of the things they wanted in housing and in police and so on and so forth. At least we've alluded to them. Mayor Lightfoot has been more effective in doing the good government issues. The first day she was in office, she did implement an executive order on aldermanic privilege. She followed up with changes in the ethics ordinance that governs the city. We could go into all the particulars, but it gave the inspector general more power. It further limited what aldermen can do because aldermen, the case of Ed Burke, it was sort of a motivating case in the 2019 election. And so there's a lot of momentum from that. The progressive side, Mayor Lightfoot has not so much disagreed in principle with the general idea of more money going to the south and west side. She has a proposal for $750 million improvement in the south and west side wards in economic development and housing development. But getting that in a time of the pandemic has been difficult. And I'm not saying it's all just the pandemic, but it has meant that the progressive agenda of affordable housing, some of the police reforms, and certainly the more economic development going into the south and west side particularly, has been slowed. So she had a poverty summit a year ago at UIC in February of 2020, which also laid out a series of steps for particularly reinvestment in, as Bill knows, in the south and west communities. And that's moved forward, but it's moving forward slowly, let me put it that way. So first, if you want to see all the recommendations, you can look up the transition team, and you might decide you like number 12 and number 27 and work on those. And secondly, she's been more successful in some reforms than she has in fulfilling some of the other parts of her own platform, as well as the transition team report.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question actually builds, I think, quite well on that. So maybe Sarah, Bill, if you want to jump in on this one, feel free. So it's about, again, about the mayor's budget, and but specifically in terms of the police divestment, and police unions. So the first one is just why there's no layoffs coming from the Chicago Police Department in Mayor Lightfoot's most recent proposed budget. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that per capita, Chicago, the CPD is quite an expensive police department. So the question here is just like, given that expense, given COVID, given the economic downturn, and also given a movement for defunding the police, why has she not addressed that in her budget?
Let me deal with just a couple of factual matters, and then Sarah and Bill can take over about the argumentation. First of all, there are 1,000 positions in the city that are vacant currently. A large number of those are in the police department. I don't remember offhand, let's say 200 or something like of that magnitude. Those are not going to be filled, so those are going to be in the police department. Of the 350 layoffs, since the police department is 40% of the budget, it is assumed that the number of layoffs in the police department will also be quite high. That would be, 120 or something. Those haven't been named yet. That is, which specific jobs would be lost, but the assumption is that a number of them will be in the police department. Now, that is still a long way from the argument about defunding the police in a major sense. On the other side, she kept the homeless funding and the $10 million extra homeless funding and $10 million extra mental health funding. So there was some rebalancing, but it's nowhere near what was usually advocated as defunding the police, which is, it's not quite clear. Does that mean taking away 40% of the city budget? Does that mean adding it to mental health facilities, or what does it mean? But she has moved towards curbing some of the police expenses, partly because there's no choice, so you have to.
I would simply add to that, I think from my perspective, there's several different issues sort of at play here, or that have in effect come together around demanding the need for significant institutional change around the police department and around how it handles issues of police violence and how it handles the budget that it does use. One is, as I think Dick was suggesting, the sort of budgetary implications. The demand for defund the police is in part rooted in the argument that because the police and policing as we currently do it commands such a heavy proportion of local expenditures, the other important expenditures always get short shrift. And we've seen this in a very active and aggressive way over the last decade or two in terms of school budgeting, in terms of mental health clinic budgeting, in terms of other kinds of social service provision. And so, part of the argument is it's simply not budgetarily possible to provide the kind of services that our communities need when so much of the budget is eaten up by the police. But there's also obviously a major issue of accountability here. What we've seen from the protests following the George Floyd murder to all of the other cases, Breonna Taylor and so forth, nationwide, is the ways in which local police departments are frequently simply not accountable to their constituents in terms of their propensity to use violence, and also that institutionally we have a system which tends to settle those kinds of cases rather than create the kinds of communities, forms of security and care and support that would prevent those kinds of that kind of violence from being meted out in a routine way. And so I think that it's beyond a budgetary issue. It's also a question of how do you restructure core institutions of city government so that they can actually be responsive to their communities. And I think we've seen, in not just in Chicago, but in many cities across the country, major institutional obstacles coming both from city governments themselves, but also from police unions who have assumed enormous power vis-a-vis the priorities that cities use and how violent officers are protected. And so I think that, there are a range of groups, and maybe other panelists can talk about them and their activities and the kind of things that your groups are doing to sort of to put the kinds of pressure that are needed to elevate not just budgetary issues, but accountability issues in the case of the Lightfoot administration, as well as in other kinds of institutions.
I would emphasize that in Chicago, especially the police union is very powerful, and they do have a lot of say, maybe more than the community would prefer. Additionally, something that I've stumbled across in my work in Chicago is how historically a lot of the institutions like the police and the political structure have evolved. And if you take a look at how the Chicago Police Department policies and procedures, what those have stemmed from, the kind of individuals even a couple hundred years ago who were joining the police force in Chicago, who were writing those policies that still have impact today, still have impact on the organizational culture and the way that the police force is structured. If you go back through that, a lot of times you can see where changes need to be made. Maybe it's not so much a question of defunding the police, it's how do we efficiently allocate these resources to meet the needs of our communities. So I think that's the real question. And I think that what people are saying when they say defund the police is that these resources are being used in a way that we feel or we see that is harmful to our community and to our city. So it's a question of reevaluation and looking back to see where changes can be made to make a more effective system to keep communities safe.
Sarah? I actually just have like a direct follow-up question to Bill. I know you're well, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I gather you're a union man. Do you think police unions are a good idea?
In the case of police, I think that there are ways in which you can weaken the police union in ways that it no longer exerts the kind of influence and power over policy that you see in a city like Chicago. I think that that is going to be difficult to do unless there's not only continued sustained pressure from below, from communities, from activists, from social movements, but also a very concerted effort on the part of a federal administration to make this a priority. I think what we've seen historically is it's very unusual for cities to reform themselves on this issue without very significant federal intervention and encouragement. Clearly, we have not gotten that in recent years, and so I think that one of the priorities of a Biden-Harris administration, if there is such a thing, needs to be the police reform in our cities. And I think my own view is that this should be a major component of a new urban policy in which it's the role of the federal government to assist and prod and use its powers of intervention to compel, in some cases, cities to institutionally change how they structure themselves, how they govern themselves, and how they allocate power to particular kinds of non-governmental organizations like the police union.
I wonder if that advocacy might change on November 4th a little bit if Trump wins. Huh?
So one thing I would say is if there is a new administration sworn into office, and if the Democrats happen to win both the House and the Senate, this would be a very important time to come forward with much more substantial changes that we could overnight. Usually is talk about the first 100 days. Sometimes it's the first 1,000 days in a president's administration. It's called a honeymoon, in which things can get done that could never get done at other times. And particularly with a backlash to the Trump era, it would be possible to make major changes. So if any of the folks on this call have a desire to make major leaps forward in social justice issues, need to be prepared to do it immediately after January 20th, when the new administration is sworn in. If Trump is put into office, quite frankly, we're going to have a resistance because democracy is going to be threatened. Examples of Hungary, examples of Venezuela. I don't usually go as far as the Third Reich in the Nazi era with Hitler, but democracy itself is at stake in America. And we're at a point where certainly an autocracy could come and permanently damage the democracy in a way that would be irreparable.
It seems to me that Stevie, Chicago Votes is ready to mobilize quick progressive change. Is that something that's on your radar?
In terms of the presidential election?
In terms of using potentially forthcoming federal resources to shape local politics?
We are a part of coalitions that are developing that kind of rapid response and mobilization. I think the level of mobilization that is necessary requires coalition building and not any one institution like Chicago Votes. But we are a part of a large coalition of community organizers, community organizations that have been in robust dialogue for a number of months now about what are we going to do after this election, exploring the different potential outcomes from this election, and how we were going to rapidly mobilize based off of those different potential outcomes. And that's something that's happening locally. We are also part of the same conversations with a totally different coalition nationally. So there's definitely a lot of young people, a lot of organizers, a lot of activists, a lot of organizations across the country and here locally in Chicago that are thinking strategically about what the world, or how we make an effective impact on the world post November 4th through 8th, however long it takes for us to get the results from the election week.
I think again, you're the voice of optimism.
I would just add, since we're talking about the election and in particular sort of its potential federal outcomes, I think that it's sometimes the case that people in Chicago, people in Illinois, sort of look at the polls and decide that Illinois is a sort of a blue state, and the sort of federal election is, as far as Illinois voters, kind of a foregone, or at least that the state outcome of that vote for the presidential election is kind of a foregone conclusion. And so therefore there's little that Illinois voters can do to sort of shape the outcome, because they're not a swing state. They're not one of the handful of swing states that have been focused on as so critical. I would point out, though, that there are still, even this late date, opportunities to become involved. If you are interested and willing to go to Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania or other so-called swing states, there are get out the vote efforts that Illinoisans can play a role in. And there's poll observer roles that you can play. It's still time to get trained for that. And so if people really want to sort of feel like they're at the center of the action in terms of the federal presidential race, there are opportunities in nearby states to do that.
Thank you. So we have a question that's talking a little bit about politics, not just in terms of as citizens or residents or voters, but also in our role as researchers, as sociologists, as the case may be, and how integrating politics at the local level, at the state level, might play into this sort of research vocation.
So particularly for graduate students and faculty, there is a social science network which does research on policy change, like say, for instance, in the criminal justice area, but in lots of areas. And we become advisors to aldermen, mayors, and others. In addition, we write op-eds. That is, we try and influence in different ways public opinion, but also public officials by producing evidence-based, that's a term not known to the the current administration in Washington, but we actually do know a lot of things about a lot of issues, including the pandemic. And we try and integrate that. And then sociologists are actually taking, and political scientists are actually taking a lead in that effort, not only here in Chicago with our organization of 100 faculty and graduate students, but also nationally. But that's also a role, it used to be called public intellectual. People who research at universities can have an impact. You can find ways to publish your findings besides in journals or even textbooks. There are other ways to influence the world if you actually know something. And so there is a role for researchers. I would argue for activism as well, but even if you decide only to do research, your research could have an effect on public policy.
Something that I would add is that activism and research, a lot of times activism can inform your research question and inform how you can effectively apply the research methods that you'll learn in school or learn in class. I know from my own experience, I developed my undergraduate research questions from campaign. I was going around, I was knocking on doors trying to get people to vote, and people would always be talking about, my taxes are too high. Why are my taxes so high? I want you to tell me about taxes. And so when I came back to school, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this research on tax formulas and taxes. And you can uncover so many questions that you didn't know were to be had by just putting yourself out there and getting involved, just putting your foot through the door. You're not going to come in as the top researcher. You have to come in any way that you can. And from there, you'll start to develop an expertise and you'll start to develop questions that you have that you feel that you can contribute to. So I would just say, if you're starting out, get your foot in the door any way you can. Ask to intern for an alderman, intern for state government downtown. There's so many ways that you can get involved, and you can discover so many ways to move forward with research and move forward with ideas that you didn't even know existed before. So that's my advice.
I would just piggyback on Sarah's comment, which I think I agree with wholeheartedly. And I think as well that the point that sort of activism can come to inform your research in really deep and profound ways. I've seen very much, and this is particularly, I think, directed to the folks who are kind of graduate students who are part of this event, folks who in fact have embedded themselves in community campaigns, who've been activists around sort of social movement mobilization, who've done grassroots work in neighborhood-based community organizations. For many of those folks, that sort of experience has been pivotal for launching them into a research career that focuses in a really deep and sort of rich and profound ways on politics as it's experienced at the local level, politics as it's understood and framed and interpreted by people who participate in politics in various ways. And so I sort of want to put a shout out for not just sort of research that informs immediate policy or that shapes the public debate, the sorts of things that Dick and other people have referred to, but also that shapes really long-lasting scholarship, the ethnographic accounts of community change, the kind of deeply experienced and field-worked kinds of observations that really get us even very deeply into how people understand their communities, what they see as what they can do in response to those communities, and what kinds of impacts that those have in the long term, in their lives, in their families, in their networks.
Yeah, so I think some of the most profound political conversations I've had have been with people who are inmates in Cook County Jail. And it's informed my research immeasurably. And so I'm in their debt. That's 5. So I think we are all out of time. I want to thank everybody for participating, for sharing your work that you're doing, for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your fears in these next few weeks and your hopes as well. And so I look forward to seeing you all again. And thanks for everyone for watching.
Thank you all.
Make sure you go to vote, please.